Hello, welcome back. It seems to be the summer of anniversaries this year, probably quite coincidentally. We've been recently celebrating 50 years of Jaws at the cinema. Last weekend, we celebrated 40 years of Live Aid, the world-changing concert that brought the world together, however briefly, back in summer 1985. And incidentally, if you're interested in Live Aid, 3 terrific documentaries, hour-long documentaries, up on BBC iPlayer. I think 2 of them were broadcast on BBC Two on Sunday, the 3rd one this Sunday, but they're all available on the iPlayer and I've watched them. You may think you've heard everything there is to be said about Band-Aid and Live Aid and the aftermath of it all, but these documentaries really are the final word. So highly recommended. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about in this video, because it's also, well, was last weekend, in fact, the 40th anniversary of a hugely iconic family favourite science fiction feature film. I'm talking, of course, about Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale's Back to the Future. Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. My name is Paul Mount. If you're new here, just press the like and subscribe button, because this channel covers all sorts of stuff like this. Classic films, classic sci-fi, classic TV, some modern TV, all sorts of other bits and pieces, unboxings, all that sort of caper. So why not like and subscribe to the channel? That would be an ace thing for you to do. Back to the Future came out on July the 3rd, 1985, and it has a very interesting history. My history with it is quite interesting as well, because I didn't see it at the time. I didn't see Back to the Future, I don't think, until it came out on DVD. I remember the early days of DVD when there were like 4 or 5 different DVD magazines published every month. And there was always much excitement when there was news of the upcoming DVD release of some classic film franchise. And I remember much excitement about the Back to the Future films when they finally arrived on DVD. Since then, we've had them on Blu-ray, we've had them on 4K. And that's the format on which I watched the original Back to the Future last Sunday. And I've only seen the films, as I said, a couple of times, which is remarkable, really, because I do enjoy the films. I think they're really entertaining. But they're not, for some reason, films I've felt the need to go back to all that often. I think I first watched it, as I said, when it came out on DVD, and I do remember watching the trilogy again when they arrived on Blu-ray. And having watched Back to the Future again on Sunday, I'm going to watch them all again on 4K, and there's lots of new special features and so on the disc, so I really must dig into that set over the summer months. Back to the Future itself then is a great film. It is a classic film, possibly a little bit underrated in terms of that era of films, which was hugely imaginative. And you watch Back to the Future now and you sort of think, why aren't they making films like this now? We had Star Wars, we had Indiana Jones, we had this big explosion of imagination, thanks to the likes of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg and Robert Zemeckis. And we don't seem to have those sorts of filmmakers around now. Filmmaking has become much more about franchises and sequels and bigger and better effects and bigger things happening on the screen. Back to the Future is quite an intimate little science fiction series, really, which all centres around one character and one family, the McFly family, particularly Michael J. Fox's Marty. And as I said, it's a very small science fiction film that deals in some quite interesting concepts of time paradox stories, which have been done before and been done since, but they're always interesting, those ideas about travelling back to the past to meet your younger self or to meet your parents before they married, and how you could influence them if you could do that sort of thing in a positive and negative sense. And I do wish that filmmakers today would cast around for these sorts of genre stories rather than looking for the bigger bang. But that's a whole other issue and possibly a whole other video. So I watched Back to the Future again on Sunday, and it just transported me again. And because I've not seen it that many times, little things about it struck me possibly for the first time. And what I particularly like about it is its structure in terms of its script. It's very well put together, and it introduces characters, introduces situations, sets things up, and then we go full tilt into the actual adventure. It's a very measured film. It starts off, as you will know, with this sort of quite interesting sort of pan tracking shot around the laboratory of Doc Emmett Brown, played with fantastic charismatic eccentricity by the brilliant Christopher Lloyd. We then meet Marty McFly, who turns up at the doc's place, and there's a little bit of business with his speaker, which explodes. Then Marty picks up the phone, because this is pre-mobile phones, of course, and there's a call from the professor, sounding a bit frantic, sounding a bit worked up, telling Marty to meet him at 1:15 in the town's nearby Mal. This sets things up, that there's something happening. There's a story waiting around the corner. We are already intrigued. What's going on? Why is this mysterious character summoning Marty to join him in the middle of the night? The film then takes a bit of time, not a lot of time, but it does it very well in introducing us properly to Marty. We meet his family, we meet his schoolmates, we meet his girlfriend, and we discover in some quite succinct scenes where Marty is in the world. And he's not really in a great place. He's not respected at school. His headmaster thinks that, like his father before him, he'll do nothing with his life. He'll make nothing of his life. His father, played by Crispin Glover, is nervous and jittery and afraid of his own shadow. His mother is pretty much an alcoholic, and his brother and sister are sort of wasters, really, and they're sort of ambling their way through life. The only good thing he has in his life is his girlfriend. So this sets up where Marty is and the position that he's in, and his life's not in a great place. Marty rushes to his middle of the night meeting with Doc Brown at the Mall to find that Doc Brown has a time machine in the shape of a classic converted DeLorean. Unfortunately, Doc Brown is killed by Libyan terrorists. Turns out that for various reasons to do with the plot, he has double-crossed some Libyan terrorist in order to get what he needs to power his DeLorean. So he's murdered. Marty climbs into the machine and powers it up and discovers that when it reaches a certain speed, it transports itself into the past, and he finds himself back in the 1950s. He's in his hometown in the 1950s, and he finds himself meeting up with younger versions of people he knows in the 1980s. The local bully, Biff Tannen, who's also bullying his father in the 1980s. He meets up with younger versions of his mother and younger versions of his father. The alarming situation here is that his father, who is played by Crispin Glover again, he has very poor social skills. He doesn't really talk to people. He doesn't talk to girls. He spends his time writing science fiction stories and being obsessed by science fiction. Imagine being like that. Marty realizes that if he doesn't engineer a way to bring his mother and father together as youngsters, he and his family will never exist, and he sees proof of this when he looks at a family photograph and various family members are fading away from it because time doesn't seem to be going in the way that it should. Marty begins to realize that it's entirely up to him to make sure that he exists in the future, so he has to work hard to bring his father and mother together in the past, against everything that's thrown against them, particularly the unwelcome advances of Biff, who is imposing himself upon Marty's mother, Lorraine. And that's really the storyline. There's no huge consequences. There's no huge universe-threatening creature or threat or anything massive going on. It's a very small and intimate story about a family and about Marty's attempt to make sure that his family exists into the 1980s, and inadvertently, as it turns out, making his family in the 1980s better people. And that's so refreshing. As I mentioned, today's science fiction films are about the spectacle because the spectacle is now available to filmmakers, so they use it. Back in the 1980s, visual effects were a little bit more simplistic. In fact, the visual effects in Back to the Future in certain places aren't quite finished. I think you can see it in one or two early scenes in the Mall, where there's some matte work that's not quite finished. There's a reason for that, which I'll come to shortly. But it's so refreshing to watch a film on such a small scale, which deals with such an interesting idea. And it is an old science fiction idea, the idea of tampering with your own timeline, trying to make sure that your own future timeline isn't disrupted and that things are the way that you know they are. And in fact, Marty's involvement in the past makes his life in the 80s better. However, there are one or two sequences which I think today probably would be deemed, and I hate to say it, inappropriate. And I think anybody who wrote this script today would be encouraged to remove these sequences or rework them in some way, because I can understand that people might think, oh, that's a bit weird. When Marty goes back into the past and meets the younger version of his mother, she takes a fancy to Marty. She takes a shine to him. He's a real hunk, and she's got her eyes on him, and she wants to get her claws into him. This is Marty meeting a young version of his mother, and his mother is attracted to him. And there are a couple of sequences that are a bit sort of, ooh, but she's sort of making advances to him. And there's one particular scene when they're in the car together at the dance towards the end of the film. And she sort of pounces on him and starts to kiss him. And you think, oh, hang on, he's kissing his mother in quite a passionate way. What's odd about that scene, of course, she pulls away because she realises, oh, there's something not quite right here. It's almost like a temporal involvement to sort of warn her off that what she's doing isn't right. But she does have an odd line of dialogue where she says, it's weird, kissing you feels like kissing my brother. You kiss your brother like that? Okay. And then later on in the film, again, it's a scene which I think would be toned down a little bit these days, where Biff, who's been making inappropriate advances to her throughout the film, he gets her in the car alone and he's basically trying to sexually assault her. And Marty's father, Crispin Glover, comes along to try and break it up, and he gets short shrift and Marty tries to break it up. But I think these days that scene would be, as I say, toned back a little bit, because it's quite clearly suggesting that she's fighting against him. She doesn't want Biff, but he's forcing himself on her. So I think these days those scenes would be slightly different. And that just struck me. I didn't find it offensive, of course not. I'm way beyond that sort of thing. But I just thought it was odd that a family film in the 1980s had such upfront, quite startling scenes. And maybe that just reflects the way that we've all become a bit softer since then. And the whole idea of culture being a little bit more keen to be offended and shocked than we were in the 1980s. Perhaps we were made of tougher stuff back then. But I think certainly now it does seem unusual, because you wouldn't have that in a modern film. And I know specifically TV series shy away from stuff like that. But this is a time travel story dealing with these sorts of issues. And I think because it has a fantastical edge to it, it gets away with it. But I think that any version of this film made today, and hopefully there won't be one, would not include those particular sequences. Audiences are now conditioned to be offended by things like that, which is a shame. It's a condemnation perhaps of the way we've become. But beyond all that, this is a massively entertaining film. It's so well written, it's so well structured. Michael J. Fox is superb in this star-making role. At the time this was made, he was still starring in an American TV comedy series called Family Ties. And this was his sort of big break as far as the silver screen is concerned. He went on to have loads of hits and loads of other films throughout the 80s, coming back to the series at the end of the 80s. But otherwise, it is a great cast generally. Crispin Glover, I think his portrayal of Marty's father is sometimes, and certainly at the time when the film was made, considered a bit, what the hell is he doing? But I think he plays it very well as this socially awkward young man back in the 50s and a socially awkward elder man back in the 1980s. But I think what is very nice about the film is the way that things do change when Marty gets back to the future. His involvement in the past has changed things, but only to the extent that his mother is no longer an alcoholic. She and her father, who's much more confident, he's a successful science fiction author, they are still very much in love, and his brother and sister and now have jobs and careers and futures, which they didn't have before. So him going back in the past has an effect on the future, but it doesn't disrupt the timeline generally. Kudos also to Christopher Lloyd's superb performance as Doc Brown. He, as I said, he has this fantastic wild-haired, wild-eyed eccentricity about him. And in terms of the spectacle of the film, there isn't a lot really, but there's a scene at the end where to power the DeLorean, to get it back to the future, they need to synchronize it with an electrical storm, which is due to hit the town, which again is foreshadowed earlier on in the film. That's how well put together the film is. There are a couple of things that you might regard as Chekhov's guns, but they're nicely foreshadowed and they're little bits and pieces dotted throughout the film, which are picked up here and there. And there's the scene with the clock tower and the electricity striking the DeLorean so it can travel back to the future. I keep saying back to the future because that's what it does. It's just a great film. It's such fun. It's so entertaining, so colourful, so vibrant. There's a great musical soundtrack, of course. Huey Lewis and the News, the classic track, Power of Love. Huey Lewis makes a brief cameo appearance at the beginning of the film. And it feels fresh even today. And I think probably more so today because science fiction films don't do these small-scale stories anymore. It's all on a much bigger, louder scale, much less subtle scale. So I found this film hugely enjoyable. And it's interesting, the backstory of how the film came about, because Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale had worked together for years. They'd come up with the story for the film and written provisional early scripts back in 1980, but they couldn't get any studios interested in the film. And again, it's a symptom of changing times, because back then studios didn't think that it was raunchy enough, because there were a lot of lowbrow comedies like Porky's around at the time. And because this was about teenagers, they didn't think that it was lewd and crude enough, basically. So they just couldn't get the film financed. 40 studios turned it down, apparently. But it's only when Robert Zemeckis had a surprise hit with Romancing the Stone in 1984 that studios suddenly took an interest in this unmade project, and the film went into production. It wasn't an easy production. Its legendarily actor Eric Stoltz was first cast to play Marty McFly because of unavailability issues with Michael J. Fox on the TV series. But after a few weeks shooting, it soon became obvious that his performance wasn't what the film needed. And there were some backstage issues as well. Eric Stoltz, a more intense actor, not a light comedy actor, which I think is something that he commented on later on. Why did they cast me for this? I'm not a comedy actor. So ultimately, Robert Zemeckis had to remove Eric Stoltz from the film, and he is quoted as saying the most difficult meeting he ever had was to sack Eric Stoltz after about a month. And what he'd shot was pretty much refilmed, and the production carried on. Early cuts of the film went down very well. The public liked it, the studio liked it, and the studio wanted to bring it forward to a July release date because it was planned for later in the year, because summer had now been established as blockbuster cinema season. So the studio managed to bring the film forward, which is why some of the effects are unfinished. It had to be hastily edited, hastily put together. Post-production was rushed. Fortunately, there aren't that many special effects, but even so, the film wasn't quite ready to go when it had to be released. The rest is history. The film, which cost $19 million to make, made worldwide just under 400 million, 388.8 million to be precise. That doesn't seem a lot today when you look at the box office numbers for films these days, but this is 40 years ago. That was a massive figure, and the film was a huge hit and was a massive summer sensation. As I said, I didn't see it at the time. I think at that time I wasn't really a big cinema goer. I was much more loyal to TV. I thought TV is the place for great storytelling. Of course, now things have flipped rather. It's TV that's become the place for intelligent, creative, long-form storytelling, and film has slightly devolved into this knockabout fantasy factory, which is, a whole other issue. The film ends with Marty back in 1985. He meets up with his girlfriend, and suddenly Doc Brown reappears in the DeLorean, and Marty and his girlfriend get aboard the DeLorean because they have to get back to the future, because there's a problem has arisen with Marty and his girlfriend's kids. We end with the classic sequence.
Where we're going, we don't need roads.
And the DeLorean lifts off, hurtles into the sky, spins around, and comes back towards the camera. Cue credits. It's a great ending, which suggests a sequel, which was never actually intended at the time. I think it was intended that would be it, and we'd never really find out what the problem was in the future. Although I suspect that they must have written that thinking, it would be nice if we get another one out of this, that would be really good. But the film was such a huge hit that sequels were inevitable. But it took their time. They took a long time getting the scripts ready and building the sets and getting the production up to speed. And the two films were eventually made. Back to the Future 2 came out in 1989, and Back to the Future 3, the final part of the trilogy, came out in 1990. But maybe that's for another video. What a great film. If you've not seen Back to the Future for years, it really is one I think you can just put on at any time and it will just lift your spirits, because it's so good-natured, it's so good-hearted, it's such a good story, well constructed, well written, great cast, great performances, great music. And as I say, it just makes me wish we could get more films like this these days, of original ideas, fun ideas that aren't all about the spectacle. So that's Back to the Future. It's available on this fantastic 4K set, and you can still pick it up on DVD if you want to, and Blu-ray. Back to the Future is brilliant. I'm going to give it 10 out of 10. Right, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little video. If you have, please like and subscribe. Do the like and subscribe thing, that would be nice. There's loads more stuff to come on this channel. Boxings, reviews, retrospectives on old TV and film, Doctor Who stuff. There's all sorts of stuff in the pipeline, so stick around, please. I'll see you soon. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.